Washington Journal continues.
Our next guest is John Logsdon. He is the founder of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. He's also a president emeritus of political science at GW. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Happy to be here.
So you're here to talk about whether or not life can be supported on Mars. NASA made a big discovery and a big announcement this week. What did they find out?
Well, I mean, NASA overhyped what they found. We've known that there's water on Mars for a long time, but water in frozen form. What this announcement was is evidence of liquid water some of the time, some of the places on Mars. We didn't see, they're not swimming pools up there. This was basically wet sand. And what was detected were a particular mineral, a perchlorate salt that was liquefied, and the only way to liquefy it was with flowing water. So this wasn't a direct detection of liquid water, it was the result of liquid water. So,
evidence of the presence of liquid water.
Exactly. So NASA these days ties everything to a journey to Mars. And so calling this a Mars mystery, I think, was a bit overstated, but yeah, it's a significant discovery.
So why is it, if we've known that there's water on Mars for a while, why was this particular finding so interesting? Water in a frozen form, why is that any more interesting than water in any other form?
Well, I think there's a sense that water equates to life. That
follow the water. That's
follow the water has been the strategy of NASA on Mars for the past 15 years. I mean, all of the Martian missions, among other things, have been looking for where water is because of the notion that where there's water, there's the potential for life or habitability. And so finding water, evidence of water in liquid form, is just one more step in that process of discovery.
And what is the likelihood, do you think, that there might be some type of life on Mars?
Oh, who knows? We got to go and find out, basically. It's a profound discovery either way. I mean, if there is, first of all, it's not going to be little green men. There's nobody swimming around up there. I mean, the question is whether there are microbes or some very basic form of life that's emerged with carbon there, with water there. Those are the conditions in which life can emerge. And if life is on two run-of-the-mill planets in one solar system, the chances are that it's a fairly common phenomenon in the universe. If we don't find it there, then we keep looking other places.
In the New York Times, the reporter, Kenneth Chang, wrote about the NASA discovery and included this quote from James L. Green, the director of NASA's Planetary Science Division, who said, "Does life exist beyond Earth? Following the water is a critical element of that. We now have, I think, great opportunities in the right locations on Mars to thoroughly investigate that." The reporter says that represents a shift in tone for NASA, where officials have repeatedly played down the notion that the dusty and desolate landscape of Mars could be inhabited today. What is NASA's ultimate goal in terms of exploration of Mars?
Well, I think the ultimate goal for NASA, and we have to go beyond NASA a little bit, but for NASA is really to understand all aspects of Mars as a very interesting place to explore. And the bottom line question is, are there life forms? Is there life now, or was there ever life on Mars? I mean, to find another life form this close in the universe would be a very profound discovery.
We want to open up the phone lines to you. You can ask your questions or share your thoughts and comments with John Logsdon. He is the founder of the Planetary Society at George Washington University. We're breaking up the phone lines by region today, so if you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, you can call us at 202-748-8000. Those in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, you can dial us at 202-748-8001. You can send us a tweet. We're on Twitter at C-SPAN-WJ. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/C-SPAN. You can join the conversation there. Or you can send us an email at journal@c-span.org. Obviously, these types of missions and these types of discoveries come with a big price tag attached to them. Do you have any sense of how much this discovery cost?
Oh, not very much. in the sense that it comes from a spacecraft, the Mars, blanking on the right name, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has been in orbit around Mars for a number of years. So it does continuing observation, and then scientists on Earth analyze the data. So this comes from analysis of data over a period of years by a group of scientists. You're talking about tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but this is not $1 billion.
For the analysis, but for the actual...
for the spacecraft?
Yes.
Oh, it was launched some years ago. I think, if I remember, MRO is kind of a $500 million. It's a medium-sized robotic mission compared to something like the Curiosity rover that's on the surface of Mars. It was a $2 billion plus mission. Those are relatively, in day-to-day terms, expensive things to do, but in terms of space program costs, these are not very expensive undertakings.
Even so, do you think that this is the right way for NASA to be spending even a medium-sized project money?
Well, what's NASA for except discovery? I think this is precisely the sort of thing that a government space agency should be doing, is exploration, is science, is discovery of addressing questions that have fascinated humans forever, like are we alone? Seems to me exactly what NASA should be doing.
We'll take our first caller, and that will be Carl from Seattle, Washington. Carl, you were on the air with John Logsdon from the Planetary Society at George Washington University.
Good morning. Regarding human space travel to Mars, I understand that with the radiation that they would be subjected to in a trip to Mars, that there is no technology that could be transported along with the people to shield them from radiation, that the mortality rate would be unacceptably high on such a mission. Can you speak to that?
I can, Carl. It's a little bit of an old impression you have. There's been enough work on radiation dosage and radiation shielding to move the question from a showstopper, you can't get to Mars without getting fried by radiation, to kind of an ethical question. Is the dosage that you're likely to get acceptable to the person that's going to get it? Is it okay to expose people to that degree of radiation and increase their cancer risk by some small percentage over time? And say that's an ethical question, a question for kind of government policy, but the ability to shield against lethal radiation is pretty well established by now.
We are speaking with John Logsdon. I just want to clarify that you are a board member of the Planetary Society, but you're founder of the Space Policy Institute, and that is what's located at George Washington University.
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of what Mars is like as a planet? Just what's the temperature, what's the terrain, what do we know already about Mars?
Well, I mean, Mars is overall a dry place. It has a very thin atmosphere. It does have an atmosphere. It has about the gravity of 1/3 the gravity of the Earth. So it's not without gravity. It's a cold place, except during the Martian, it has seasons. And during the Martian summer, apparently at the places where this liquid flow has been identified, the temperature can get up to 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But most of the time it's a very cold, barren place. It has mountains higher than Everest, has canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon. It's a world with all kinds of terrain. If one goes to see the new movie, The Martian, it's a pretty accurate representation of what Mars would look like.
Our next caller is Jack from Clinton Township, Michigan. Jack, go ahead. You are on the air now.
Yes, I'm saying that the planet Earth is about 60% covered with water. And why is it we're not finding about 38,000 new life forms per week?
Well, where's the number 38,000 come from? We are still finding a lot of new life forms on both land and water on Earth to start out with. The biologists, botanists are finding both animal and plant life forms all the time. But also, what you're interested in is the evolution of life forms. This planet has been covered with water for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and various life forms, even us, have evolved. Mars lost its surface water a long time ago, and so there hasn't been the opportunity for life forms to evolve there in the way they have on this planet.
So let me just clarify, you're saying that Mars lost its water source as opposed to maybe it's developing a water source. This is water remnants that you think that we're seeing versus
I think
this is water that's...
There's a pretty broad consensus that Mars once had oceans. And through where it is in the solar system, the water evaporated, basically. The atmosphere evaporated. Mars may once have been a fairly lush place early on in the history of the solar system, and has evolved into a place with frozen water but otherwise dry. So
it's an appropriate question then, really, did there used to be life on Mars?
Well, yeah, it's more likely that there used to be life than there is now. Mars in the past was probably a more congenial place for life to emerge than it is to support life now.
Let's listen to NASA Chief Scientist Ellen Stofan. She was at a House hearing recently to discuss the institution's multi-stage process toward exploring the red planet.
I think that's what NASA has developed by saying we do need boots on the ground. I personally think it's achievable that we meet the President's goal of getting humans in the Mars vicinity in the 2030s. I think it's completely doable. And in the meantime, of course, continuing our robotic exploration like we're doing with the Mars 2020, moving with the Europa mission to go and explore Europa. So I don't think it's an either or, I think it's an and. We need to do the technology research here on the ground. We need to do biological research, and certainly synthetic biology is an amazing expanding field at this point in time. But I think it's all of those things together that help us move forward scientifically and help us refine the scientific questions as we move forward.
And that was NASA Chief Scientist Ellen Stofan testifying at a recent hearing on Capitol Hill. We're speaking with John Logsdon. He is the founder of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. She said boots on the ground in Mars by 2030. Do you think that's realistic?
She said in the 2030s.
In the 2030s.
So that's a 10-year time span. You mentioned that I'm a board member of the Planetary Society, which is the largest citizen advocacy space group in the world. We just this week released a report talking about humans orbiting Mars as a step to landing on Mars in the architecture jargon word. In the plan that's central to this report, the first landing mission would be 2039. You would have astronauts orbiting Mars and perhaps visiting the Martian moon Phobos in the early 2030s, maybe 2033 is a particularly good time to go from Earth to Mars. So given the continued funding of NASA, given NASA stopped funding the International Space Station at $3 billion a year sometime in the mid-2020s. Yes, we concluded it's doable, that there are plans that could get us to Mars in the 2030s.
Our next caller now is Catherine from Conway, New Hampshire. Catherine, go ahead. You're on the air with John Logsdon.
Good morning. I had a question, and then I had an idea. And you know, we have so many strange things in the universe like black holes. And are there such things in the universe as whirlwinds forces that could have carried away the soil and the atmosphere and the water when the planets were formed early in our solar system? I've never heard of whirlwinds, but it wouldn't surprise me. And the other thing is, my idea is, not only have robots there, but send 3D printers that the robots could run, and they could set up the facilities for the arrival of humans eventually.
Well, it's a nice idea, and let's go back first to the whirlwinds. No whirlwinds because there's no air to be wind between the planets. And after all, space is basically a vacuum. I mean, there's stuff there, but not very much stuff. But there's one theory called panspermia. One of the things that the solar system is full of is collisions of things banging into one another. And there is a suggestion that life, for example, may have been on Mars. Mars collided with some object, tossed pieces of Mars off the planet's surface, and some of them landed on Earth.
Is this the Bill Nye the Science Guy theory?
Well, Bill, it's not Bill's theory, but Bill likes it. Right. I mean, there are serious people, I include Mr. Nye among a serious person, who believe that one possibility is that we're Martians, that Earth life evolved from fragments of stuff that came from Mars. I don't have any basis for saying how likely that is. But the solar system is a lively place, but it's not winds, it's things banging into one another and scattering material, comets coming through, some colliding. You know, the comets may be carrying life forms because they're coming, a lot of them have a lot of carbon on them and moisture, and they come in from the Oort cloud out beyond Pluto, and the Van Kuiper belt. This is fun, you know, these sort of things. But, well, you know, one theory says that it's comets that carry life forms, and when they collide with a solid body like the Earth, that's where life came from. They could, almost certainly did collide with Mars along the way. 3D printing is a fascinating new technology. Whether it could make structures large enough to be useful to crews arriving on Mars, I haven't thought that through. I know the people that like 3D printing are working on issues like that. So that's not a wild idea at all.
Next up on the phone lines is Jeff from Birmingham, Alabama. Jeff, what is your question or comment this morning?
Yes, I'm a big supporter of the space launch system. I think some of the planetary scientists were spoiled, perhaps, by launching a lot of these Delta II sounding rockets that they were chain smoking. And right now, I mean, if you want to have anything even remotely like what you see in the movie The Martian, you need to have larger launch vehicles. The reasons that the Russians were able to get ahead of us is they had the philosophy of don't overthink the payload, just make the bloody rocket bigger. And yet that is the SLS has met very ugly resistance either from folks who are used to these little bomb disposal robots or the Air Force trying to force evolved expendable launch vehicles down our throats, or worse, some of these anti-NASA, anti-government libertarians who think Elon Musk is going to save the world. What did it take? How many heads did Bill Nye had to crack to get some of these people to start understanding that, yes, we do need shoulder-derived heavy lift if we're to put anything up there on Mars besides a toy?
Well, the image of Bill cracking heads is kind of funny. And you're from Alabama, which is where the Space Launch System, that's what SLS is based at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. I think that there is an emerging consensus that we cannot do things like send humans to Mars without a big rocket, kind of like the Saturn V we had to go to the moon. And the SLS is the big rocket that is currently under development, scheduled for an initial launch in 3 years with a kind of dummy payload, not crew aboard, and then a crew launch which just slipped 2 years to 2023. I don't know how to sort out all of the things that one could respond to in your comment, but I think that there, well, for example, you mentioned Mr. Nye as a board member of the Planetary Society. I have a lot of interaction with Bill. Bill started out very skeptical of the value of SLS, and has come around as he recognizes if we're going to do ambitious Martian missions, we need a heavy launch vehicle, and that's the one we've got, so we better support it.
Sean from Tampa, Florida is up next. Sean, go ahead. You're on the air.
How you doing? How y'all doing?
We're good. What's your question today?
I don't have so much as a question. I'm gonna have so much as a statement. I don't know. I heard him talking about going to the moon. I mean, going to Mars and radiation or whatever. But I was wondering why haven't people colonized the moon? And I heard him speaking again about people orbiting. Not Jupiter. I'm sorry, Mars. Like in the movie Elysium, is that really possible? Do you think that you could do that? That would be possible to make an Elysium type of atmosphere that'll orbit a planet? Thank you.
Well, I mean, let's see. Why haven't we colonized the moon? Well, we stopped sending people to the moon in December of 1972, which was a decision made by Richard Nixon that after Apollo, we were not going to continue to explore. We were going to stay in low Earth orbit near our home planet. We're now in the process of reversing that decision and beginning finally outward movement of people away from the immediate vicinity of the Earth. Mr. Obama in 2010 said, we're going to skip the moon, been there, done that. Our goal is Mars. There are people, I think I'm one of them, that think skipping the offshore island as we move out into the solar system is not a great idea. And NASA is very careful. I mean, they work for Mr. Obama. Mr. Obama says skip the moon. NASA can't say, no, we're going to the moon. And there's no money in the budget to build a moon lander. So what NASA is saying these days is we're building a big rocket. We're building the Orion spacecraft, which was originally designed for lunar missions. If somebody else builds a lunar lander, we'd be glad to work with them and do a joint mission back to the moon. And I hope that sometime in the 2020s, that possibility emerges. Orbiting Mars, I don't know the movie Elysium, so I mean, you'd do it inside a closed environment, inside a small space station if you want. So you'd have the artificial environment in which humans could survive. You wouldn't have to create anything.
So as you mentioned, sort of partners who might build some sort of moon lander, et cetera, what's the role of private industry in space exploration? You've also mentioned Elon Musk a couple of times.
Well, private industry, there are some entrepreneurs that are very interested in doing things on the moon. There are some robotic programs privately funded. One of them, Moon Express, think that they're going to launch a lander to the moon in 2 years, in 2017, on a privately funded basis, and use that as a build-up to large-scale private activities, resource extraction, making rocket fuel on the moon. There are lots of ideas of entrepreneurial commercial activities using lunar resources that could sustain a private sector enterprise. Mars, a different question, I think. Elon Musk, head of SpaceX, is a visionary and wants to die on Mars, as he says, just not on landing. One of the reasons he founded SpaceX, which is at this point building rockets and capsules to go from Earth to the space station, is that he wanted to go to Mars and found that there were no inexpensive enough rockets, inexpensive enough transportation systems. Ultimately, that's what he wants to build. He's not doing that for money. He's doing that for his vision. And there are people like that who are so taken by the vision of spreading humanity that they're willing to put their money behind it. Whether it's enough money, I think it has to be done in partnership with government myself.
Our next caller is Steve from San Jose, California. Steve, what's on your mind this morning?
Good morning, John. So I've got a question. It might be a little bit out of your field, but maybe not. Does it irritate you in the slightest that in spite of things like the visual sightings, the cattle mutilations, the crop circles, the abductions, and especially the way the U.S. government has reacted with blacked out documents that the aliens, extraterrestrial life, is here and has been here. And you can throw in the ancient stone structures that we have no idea how they built these things. And I'm talking about the ones down in South America that definitely weren't made with chicken bones. It's obvious to me, especially if you've seen the series Ancient Aliens, that they've been here for a long time.
All right, Steve from San Jose, California.
Yeah, I guess we can't get through a space segment without the kind of they're here already questions.
We're all Martians.
Yeah, or you know, from Vulcan. I have no comment on that. I mean, there are a series of things that can be explained as alien intervention. There are explanations for almost all of them separate. And I'm a skeptic, but I don't say it's impossible. Who knows?
Next up, Nancy from Kansas City, Kansas is on the phone lines. Nancy, go ahead.
Oh, hi. I'm not really a very good person with science, but I thought that Venus was closer to Earth, and I wondered why we're exploring Mars and not a planet that might be closer. Am I right about that?
Well, let's say two things. One, Venus is closer to Earth at some times, but given the orbits, if it's on the other side of the sun, it's far away. And the same is true with Mars. Sometimes Mars is close to Earth. Other times, if we're on one side of the sun and it's on the other, we're very far from one another. The problem with Venus, it's covered with clouds, and the surface temperature is about 700 degrees. And that's a little too hot for even spacecraft to survive for any length of time on the surface, much less people. So it's just a very hostile place. There have been a few kind of radar probes that have explored Mars, being able to see through the cloud layer, and found it's a rocky planet with terrain, with mountains and all of that. But it's just a place that's very hostile for humans or their machines to end up.
The Washington Post reported on this discovery and included a caveat. Here it is. This planet, meaning Mars, has been fooling us for more than a century. There were not canals on Mars, after all. There was not seasonal vegetation. The Viking mission in 1976 initially produced what seemed to be positive results in experiments looking for life, but the scientists, even life-loving Carl Sagan, eventually concluded that the surface was sterile. There's methane in the Martian atmosphere, but no one knows if it's biological or non-biological in its origin. How sure can we be that NASA's findings this past week are actually correct?
As sure as good science can be. I mean, let's say a couple of things at the same time. That same article by Joel Achenbach talked about whether NASA timed this release to the release of this information to the release of the Martian movie. This was a paper reporting on science over a number of years that was going to be presented at a planetary science conference in France this week, and NASA wanted to get out in front of that presentation. Now, sure, they were aware the movie was coming out, and so I think overhyped what this was about. I mean, science works slowly. What was reported was that using spectroscopic observations from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, there was evidence that these dark streaks called recurring something Linnae, RSL, these streaks on Mars canyons were characterized by a particular mineral that had been liquefied, and the only way to liquefy it was with flowing water. That paper, in order to be presented and published, was reviewed by a number of peers. That's how science works. And so it's as sure as you can be until the next discovery. gives you an alternate explanation.
So we found the RSL acronym spelled out. It's recurring slope lineae. Those are the downhill flows that were described as being possibly related to liquid water. Let's turn back to the phone lines now. Don from Youngwood, Pennsylvania is on the line. John, go ahead.
Hi, John. How you doing? Hey, John, listen, we got to get back to reality here. We're nowhere near have the technology to go to Mars at this time. It's too far. What propulsion do we have right now? I mean, that's even at Mars' closest approach, you're talking about a year trip.
Right. Well, let's start with the reality that there are lots of spacecraft, robotic spacecraft at Mars, on the Martian surface and orbiting Mars. They got there. So we clearly have the propulsive capability to send payloads to the Martian distance if we're willing to wait, as you say, 9 months or so between launch and arrival. Once you get something moving fast in close vicinity to the Earth, there's nothing to slow it down. And so they just go. And they don't accelerate, they just go. If you had nuclear rockets or some kinds of plasma rockets where you could get constant acceleration, you could get to Mars in a few weeks, but we don't have that yet. It'd be a nice thing to have, but there's all this phobia about nuclear propulsion, and we haven't really developed that. So with the current big rocket we're building, and a new upper stage, a new, more powerful upper stage called the exploration upper stage, we can accelerate a human-carrying spacecraft to a speed where it can get people to Mars in, let's say, 9 months. So the problem is making sure that they don't kill one another or have social disruption. We're doing an experiment. After all, there are two people, one American astronaut, Scott Kelly, and one Russian cosmonaut that are spending a year on the International Space Station precisely to get some sense of the both physical and social aspects of long-duration spaceflight. So we're working on this stuff.
Here's a question from Twitter. Say we find life on another planet. What then?
Well, what then is we recognize that life on Earth is not unique. And what that does for religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, we're not going to find probably intelligent life in this solar system. And that goes back to the question about alien visits earlier. If there are aliens, they're coming from outside our solar system. And again, I don't want to go down that route. But I think philosophically, the recognition that life has evolved in more than one place is a fairly profound discovery. What you do with it, well, first you'd say, all right, if there's life on Mars, you showed an Ellen Stofan clip. She talked about a planned mission to the moon of Jupiter, Europa. There's Jupiter, Europa has under the ice a liquid ocean. Maybe there's life there. There are potentially habitable places on several of the moons of Saturn. So we continue to explore. If we find life one place, it says, well, let's keep looking.
Next on the phone lines is Ari from Decatur, Georgia. Ari, what's on your mind?
Hi. I've been fascinated with space science and exploration all my life, and it's obvious that even in low Earth orbit, space is no place for biological humans. And I think the money spent on manned missions could be better spent on self-aware artificial intelligence and remote sensing robotics and space science.
Well, that's a perfectly legitimate point of view.
All right.
But is it satisfying that we send our machines, we send even self-aware machines, which are kind of scary, will we as a human species, or at least those cultures that have exploration as part of their culture, will we be satisfied to send our machines and not go ourselves? That's a very legitimate question. Because yes, space is a hostile environment. We're not evolved to operate in the environmental conditions of outer space. So it is expensive, it is risky to send people, and it's a social choice whether we want to do it or not. I think we should. The very first launch I saw was Apollo 11. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins walked by me on the way to the moon. I'd like to see that happen again.
Next up, Bill, also from Decatur, Georgia, is calling. Bill, go ahead.
Hello?
Hello, you're on the air.
Okay. With respect to the prospect of permanent colonization, is it known what a 0.3G environment does to mammalian fetal gestation?
The short answer is no. I mean, you'd want to do a lot of experimentation on non-advanced mammals in the Martian gravity, a 0.3 gravity environment, before you started talking about people being conceived, born, come to maturity on a different environment. Well, first of all, will the Martian settlements somehow provide artificial gravity? Probably not. That would probably be too tricky. So we need to understand. That's, again, the kind of research we need to fund. We're not ready. I don't like the word colonize, by the way. I think settle is a better word. People leaving this planet, settling someplace else. Whether we do that, depends on whether there's something useful to do, whether there's good science to do, whether there's some economic benefit of being there, or species survival benefit. So there are a lot of reasons to think about this, but there's a lot of research to be done.
We've talked about the mantra, follow the water, in terms of space exploration, looking for life, et cetera. But is it possible that there's life that does not require water to live, some life form that looks very different from our own, and how do we find that?
Yes, it's possible. I mean, we're kind of a product of our own existence, which we are carbon-based and water-based. And so it's easier for us to think that other life forms have those requirements in order to evolve. But there could conceivably be life forms that have a totally different chemistry. How do we look for it? Almost by accident, I think. You can't design experiments to look for things when you don't understand what those things are. So you'll find, conceivably, some evidence of something going on, and then design ways of figuring out what it is. I mean, we're a very ingenious species, the human race, and we've learned a lot through our science.
John Logsdon of George Washington University and the Planetary Society, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And that concludes our show for today. Please join us tomorrow. Washington Journal will be featuring Paul Brandis. He is from West Wing Report, talking about Russian airstrikes against Syria. We'll also be talking with Gail Russell Chaddock from the Christian Science Monitor, discussing the House GOP leadership elections. And we'll talk with Angela Stent. She is the former Russia and Eurasia intelligence officer for the National Intelligence Council, also discussing Russia as well. We will see you then.
Life.
Follow the water. That's
follow the water has
okay.
been the strategy of NASA on Mars for the past 15 years. I mean, all of the Martian missions, among other things, have been looking for where water is because of the notion that where there's water, there's the potential for life, for habitability. And so finding water, evidence of water in liquid form, is just one more step in that process of discovery.
And what is the likelihood, do you think, that there might be some type of life on Mars?
Oh, who knows? We got to go and find out, basically. It's a profound discovery either way. I mean, if there is, first of all, it's not going to be little green men. There's nobody swimming around up there. I mean, the question is whether there are microbes or some very basic form of life that's emerged with carbon there, with
Washington Journal continues.
Our next guest is John Logsdon. He is the founder of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. He's also a president emeritus of political science at GW. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Happy to be here.
So you're here to talk about whether or not life can be supported on Mars. NASA made a big discovery and a big announcement this week. What did they find out?
Well, I mean, NASA overhyped what they found. We've known that there's water on Mars for a long time, but water in frozen form. What this announcement was is evidence of liquid water some of the time, some of the places on Mars. We didn't see, they're not swimming pools up there. This was basically wet sand. And what was detected were a particular mineral, a perchlorate salt that was liquefied, and the only way to liquefy it was with flowing water. So this wasn't a direct detection of liquid water, it was the result of liquid water. So,
evidence of the presence of liquid water.
Exactly. So NASA these days ties everything to a journey to Mars. And so calling this a Mars mystery, I think, was a bit overstated, but yeah, it's a significant discovery.
So why is it, if we've known that there's water on Mars for a while, why was this particular finding so interesting? Water in a frozen form, why is that any more interesting than water in any other form?
Well, I think there's a sense that water equates to water there. Those are the conditions in which life can emerge. And if life is on two run-of-the-mill planets in one solar system, the chances are that it's a fairly common phenomenon in the universe. If we don't find it there, then we keep looking other places.
In the New York Times, the reporter Kenneth Chang wrote about the NASA discovery and included this quote from James L. Green, the director of NASA's Planetary Science Division, who said, "Does life exist beyond Earth? Following the water is a critical element of that. We now have, I think, great opportunities in the right locations on Mars to thoroughly investigate that." The reporter says that represents a shift in tone for NASA, where officials have repeatedly played down the notion that the dusty and desolate landscape of Mars could be inhabited today. What is NASA's ultimate goal in terms of exploration of Mars?
Well, I think the ultimate goal for NASA, and we have to go beyond NASA a little bit, but for NASA is really to understand all aspects of Mars as a very interesting place to explore. And the bottom line question is, are there life forms? Is there life now, or was there ever life on Mars? I mean, to find another life form this close in the universe would be a very profound discovery.
We want to open up the phone lines to you. You can ask your questions or share your thoughts and comments with John Logsdon. He is the founder of the Planetary Society at George Washington University. We're breaking up the phone lines by region today, so if you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, you can call us at 202-748-8000. Those in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, you can dial us at 202-748-8001. You can send us a tweet. We're on Twitter at C-SPAN WG.